The Arizal gave a fascinating hesped eulogy for Reb Moshe Cordovero the Ramak. Even more fascinating is the lesson that the Rebbe takes from that hesped, from the pasuk, the verse that it is built on, and what it teaches us about the depths of our own neshama. The pasuk is in this week's parasha. Keshemitim pasuk with parasha Seinu in connection to the pasuk in our parasha, which says v'chiyah be'ish, if there'll be a person who has chet mishpat maves, literally the sin for which his judgment is death, v'humas, and the person is put to death, says the pasuk v'salisa oisoi al eitz, you temporarily suspend him on a piece of wood, on a tree, so to speak. Is Yodua, as in dem Hesped was the Arizal hot maspid given dem Ramak. So it's well known that the Hesped eulogy that the Arizal gave for the Ramak, how to get pasuk, he took the same pasuk and explained it in a completely different way. He said, if there's a man who has a chet of the law of death, meaning to say pirush sheyechsar, meaning this is an individual who is lacking chet meloshen chesaron, because one of the interpretations of the word chet is that something is lacking, something is missing. So here's a person who is missing tam mishpat maves, a reason why they deserve to be to have to pass away at the end of their life. And why would a person be in that position? Because this is somebody who never did anything inappropriate. Why should this person pass away? Says the Arizal v'salisa oisoi al eitz, hang, suspend, blame his death on the tree. It's because of the tree of knowledge, because of that there was a decree of death for all people, and bishvel kach meis, that would be the reason why this individual has passed away. That's what the Arizal had to say about the Ramak. He did not deserve to die, other than the fact that that's what Hashem had decreed on all human beings. So now, if you look at this superficially, it would seem as the Teichen von der Drasha that what the Arizal was teaching in his interpretation of this pasuk is exactly the same with the Maimer Chazal, like the Brisa that tells us Daled Meisu be'etyo shel nachash, that there were 4 unique individuals who died only because of the advice of the snake. In other words, they died because of the Chet Eitz Hadas, essentially. Amram, the father of Moshe, Yishai, the father of David, Kilov, who was one of David's sons, Binyamin, the son of Yaakov Avinu. These were individuals who also did not pass away for any sin of their own. So it sounds like the same thing, right? As just like these 4 individuals did not sin, and therefore the only reason they died was because of the snake, and of course the advice the snake gave to Adam and Chava, which brought death into the world. Right, was the sin of Eitz Hadas is the result of the snake's advice. But Sosishal Nochosh is Nigzer Gzeres Misal Kol Todosef Shel Adam Arishon. That is what brought about the decree of death on anybody who is a descendant of Adam Arishon, which is of course every human being. So it would seem that Al Derech is given by Ramak. The exact same thing applies to the Ramak. Hazayin v'humos is given not ben Eitz Hadas, that the only reason that he deserved to pass away was because of the advice of the Nachash, which equates with the Eitz Hadas. That's what it would seem like, but maybe it's not the case. V'shleima says nit nor was the Arizal darshan den pasuk gave demin and meise be'etya shel Nachash. But actually, once you pay attention, you'll see not only is the Arizal explaining this concept of people who die because of the advice of the snake, now the mitzvah is mechadash hanayim geder, but much more importantly, the Arizal is giving us insight here into a whole new category of people who don't really deserve to die, and the only reason is because of an external cause associated with Eitz Hadas. Let's understand what that means. Let's first distinguish between the expression of the Brisa and the expression used by the Arizal. The Gemara sagt, the Brisa quoted in the Gemara says that these were people who died because of the advice of the snake. The Arizal teaches under pasuk v'salisoi al eitz, whereas the Arizal focuses on the tree, not the snake, and not the avera that the snake enticed Adam and Chava to do, but rather the tree itself. It's not only 2 different expressions saying the same thing, nor in Teichen, it's actually 2 different messages. Because when we talk about the advice the snake gave to Chava to eat from the tree, that is actually bad. It was bad advice and was advised to do something against what Hashem wants. The advice to do an Aveira. Whereas v'salisa oisoi al eitz, what the Arizal is saying, that blame the Ramak's passing on the tree itself, was the Arizal stellt sich auf ihm, redt wegen der Sach, durch welche Adam ist begangen dem Chet. That's not describing the Avera, but rather the object through which the Avera was done. Aber der Eitz Gufa is nicht ein Chesaron, but fundamentally, the Eitz Hadas is not fundamentally bad. It's not inherently bad. Especially when you consider Rashi's view, which is the simplest view, that this was a fig tree. And that is from the minim shenishtabcha b'hem Eretz Yisrael, one of the species that Eretz Yisrael is praised for having. So in other words, it's a positive tree. It's just what they did with it that was negative. Another indication that it's a positive tree is the name itself. Zainomen is Eitz Hadas, as a Tutofinian Hadas. This is a tree that instills within a person a sense of knowledge and understanding. That's obviously really positive. Can bring in, and even the potential for doing something wrong with this tree, which is if a person eats the fruit that they're not allowed to eat, the fruit of that tree, that wasn't an indefinite limitation or an indefinite sin. It was, as the Chazal tell us, till Shabbos, and when Shabbos came, they would be allowed to eat from the Eitz Hadas. So, if you say Et Yel Nachash, the advice of the Nachash, that's bad. He gave bad advice to do something which is wrong. If, like the Arizal does, you're describing the tree is not inherently bad. In other words, the Arizal is giving us a different message. Das heißt, the Arizal redt wegen Siba des Siba chulei. The Arizal is describing the cause for the cause of something wrong. In other words, there's a tree which could produce an Avera, which would bring death. Nicht wegen dem Chet Eitz Hadas. So noch a Friedrich weiter dicke Sibbe, right? There's an earlier and a latter cause. Nicht wegen dem Chet Eitz Hadas, was hat gebracht Xeris Misa befeuil. The Arizal is not describing the Avera that actually caused the introduction of death into the world. No, wegen dem Eitz, was hat gegeben der Efshorius in der Misa. Rather, he is talking about the tree which allowed the possibility, if misused or abused, to bring death into the world. If you don't listen and you eat from the fruit, vener is tevera, while it has the potential for both positive and negative, only then is most Thomas does it bring death into the world. Let's put it differently. Say this in a framework that is similar to the language of Medrash. We know that at the time Hashem created the world, He already intended to have death as part of the human experience. Which is why the Medrash tells us that already on the first day of creation, the Malach HaMoves was already created. So if Hashem wanted that there should be death in the world, why are we blaming Adam and Chava? Because we have a principle which is that the Eibishter comes up with schemes by which humans become responsible for fulfilling the plan that Hashem intended, and therefore the value is, of course, if a human makes the mess up, the human can at some point do tshuva and fix it. Because that's the system that the Eibishter uses. So practically how death entered the world was because of people and their choices and their listening to the snake. Und der Pfarr hat der Eibishter gestellt Adamen vor den größten Nesoin von Eitz Hadas. That's actually why the Eibishter set Adam Arishan up with this tremendous challenge of not eating from the forbidden fruit. Durch einpflanzen in Gan Eden kol Eitz nechmod lemare v'toiv lemeichel oich dem Eitz Hadas v'chulei. By putting in front of Adam Arishan's eyes this very desirable tree that you're not supposed to eat from, but it looks so tempting. Was doch der Malem is, so that Adam Arishan and Chava's actions could be what stimulated Hashem's original plan, which is that there should always be death in the world. So the Eibishter wanted death in the world, and He wanted us to be the ones responsible for activating it. And with that in mind, we can distinguish between the Gemara's message and the Arizal's message. The difference between people who died because of the Avera of listening to the snake and eating from the Eitz Hadas versus those who die only because there's an Eitz, because there's a system that the Eibishter made. When the Gemara tells us that there are 4 individuals who only died because of the bad advice of the Nachash, well, that's in Gemara, which is Nigle de Torah. That's the more accessible, more, dare we say, revealed or superficial part of Torah. Certainly not superficial, the revealed part of Torah. There, Nigle de Torah speaks about things that are evident, things that you can identify, things that are easy to access. So what makes sense from a Nigle perspective is, why did people die? Because there was an Avera that brought death into the world. Whereas the principle of blame the tree, which is a new perspective introduced by the Arizal at the funeral of the Ramak, of a Shaychas Ramak. Both Arizal and Reb Moshe Cordovero, they represent creating insight into the secret elements of Torah, the esoteric parts of Torah, Pnimius HaTorah. Therefore, Refidos is Bipnimius, the language that the Arizal will use, and particularly in the context of a fellow Kabbalist, is language that is, let's see what's deeper, what lies behind the story. Not just simply say, oh, they did bad, therefore people die. Was mit Zeit Pnimius ist es verbunden. The deeper reason why there's death in the world is linked nicht mit Etyer Shel Nachash. It's not linked to the mechanics of how that happened because people did something wrong and therefore they introduced death into the world. Now mit an eitz. Rather, it's linked to the fact that the Eibishter set this up by putting the tree there. Then a soin von Eitzadas was the Eibishter hat zugestellt Adama mit Tzad Retzonis Baruch v'Kavanosei behabria. Let's look deeper and understand that the tree was planted in front of them to tempt them so they would fail, so that they would introduce death into the world, which is Hashem's original plan. That's a much deeper perspective. Okay, so the Gemara is telling us, cause and effect. People did something wrong, therefore there's death in the world. Certain individuals never did anything wrong, but unfortunately there's death in the world, therefore they die. The Arizal tells us there's death in the world because the Eibishter wanted death in the world, therefore he created an eitz. There are some people who never did anything wrong in their life, but the Eibishter wants death in the world, therefore they pass away. Let's take it a step deeper. These two principles or concepts, the Gemara's expression that it's all about the bad advice of the snake, and the Arizal's expression, which is that it's all about the tree, they actually represent two different classes or categories of tzaddikim. If there's an individual who did not sin, but they die because of sin, that means that they have some susceptibility to the effects of sin. What does that mean? It means maybe they're not 100% absolutely immune to negativity. They didn't actually sin, but they're not completely immune. So the fact that Averas cause death is actually an impact in their lives. But there's a different class of tzaddikim who are so protected or so elevated that even the impact of the fact that there's a decree of death because of Averas is irrelevant to them because they have absolutely no susceptibility or association with Averas. Und der Inyan Amisa is and therefore the only reason why these people would ever possibly pass away is because of the Eibishter's grand plan, not because they are in any way susceptible to Averas. How could that be? The explanation is this. The Alter Rebbe explains as Meisubet Yeshon Nochash is Valdi Fir Tzadikim. The Alter Rebbe explains these four tzadikim the Gemara lists as being individuals who only died because of the advice that the snake gave to Adam and Chava. Says the Alter Rebbe, Afal Pi as Yisraelim given tzadikim gemurim, in spite of the fact that they were absolute tzadikim, without doubt. Is in Zenoch geblieben eze shemetz mizumas hanochash sheloi yochlu lasiroi mikol v'chol. Yet inside their system, their internal workings, there was still some contamination of the snake's avera, even though it didn't affect them, didn't translate into inappropriate behavior or speech or even thought, but it was still somewhere, so to speak, in their spiritual bloodstream. Explains what that means. Is the Indian fun. What is this contamination of the snake? It's gasus or ruach shenasa b'teva ha'adam. The fact that a person becomes either crass or self-interested. The person recognizes themselves and realizes what's lacking in their lives, or appreciates what's good in their lives. Men fehlt sich. The common denominator between anybody who is susceptible to the input of the snake is anybody who still has even the most subtle sense of self. Could be a perfect tzaddik, still have the most subtle sense of self. Das says Etya shel Nochash meint, in others, based on the Alter Rebbe's explanation, the advice of the snake and its impact on people is as the chet etzadas hat ufgiton achesorin in dem tzaddik. That means that ever since Adam and Chava ate from the tree of knowledge, it is possible for a tzaddik to also lack in a certain way. Vastos is gerim misa, and that lack is actually a justification for why that tzaddik would pass away. It's clear that the so-called lack is not because the tzaddik didn't serve Hashem properly or did something inappropriate. That's for sure. They're a tzaddik gomer. They do everything that they should. Now the Nachash, it's because the Nachash brought a contamination into the world, and the tzaddik still remains in the most abstract, subtle way susceptible to this contamination. Therefore, the tzaddik is, so to speak, deserving of death. And that's what makes the radical distinction between somebody, as the Arizal describes, who dies because of the tree rather than because of the snake's advice. This next principle is going to revolutionize how we understand not only the story of what the Arizal taught about the Ramak, but even understand ourselves. Because the bottom line is, even the most subtle degree of sin can only affect the superficial part of who we are. But the depth, the core of who a Jewish person is never contaminated, never compromised. It is always intact. As the Alter Rebbe says, even while doing the Aveira, the core of the Jew is completely dedicated to Hashem and undisturbed by the Aveira. Especially when you look from the perspective of the deepest part of the neshama, it is never in a position to ever live in the same space as the Aveira, let alone to actually do it. Now, with that in mind, we can understand if there is contamination through the snake and the act of the Eitz Hadas, the impact of that contamination on the Jew is it can only impact the Jew at a superficial level, but the depth, the core of a Jewish person can never be harmed by an Aveira. So, now the question is, where do I live? Do I live in touch with my deepest self or my superficial self? When a Jew lives with the core of their neshama being the lived, realized, revealed part of the neshama, to the extent that it filters right through to even the most superficial parts of the person. In other words, the most superficial part of that tzaddik is synchronized with and representing the essence of the neshama. That person is completely protected. They cannot be harmed by the effect, by the advice, by the misleading behavior of the snake. That's what the Arizal is saying. What happens if you have a person who does not have any justification why they should pass away because they have no relationship with bad? What the Arizal is saying is there is no reason why this person should pass away. Not even the reason of, because once the snake advised Adam and Chava, death entered the world. That is irrelevant to these people because they're untouched by that behavior, by that concept. Then the only reason you can say why this person had to pass away is blame the tree. So the fact that this individual passed away is it's because of the way that the Eibishter runs the world and generates processes and systems by which Hashem's plan is due to the failures or the poor decisions of man. In our context, it means that the Eibishter chose that there would be such a thing as an Eitz Hadas in order to fulfill his objective to have death in the world. So, means there is still some degree of susceptibility to Aveira. Somebody who's living completely aligned with the essence of their neshama, and therefore Aveiras are not even on the table, not even in the most abstract, subtle form. Going back to what we already mentioned, this is a topic that only comes to light when you're dealing with people of the caliber of the Arizal and the Ramosha Kodevera. Their entire purpose and objective in life is to be the ones to share and to teach the esoteric parts of Torah to the rest of the world. Therefore, that's what they were doing. They're exposing an esoteric perspective that nobody would have known. War die Gile von Sosim de Eiraisa, ist verbunden mit den Gile von Sosim de Nishmasa. We well know that Torah and the Neshama reflect each other. And just as you have the deepest core of the Torah, so it will relate to the deepest core of the Neshama. So those people whose shlichus in life is to reveal the deepest part of Torah will naturally speak also to the deepest part of the Neshama. And that deepest part of the Neshama, was is Hecher von Etish and Nachash, is completely beyond the reach of the negativity of the snake and its effects. Okiyadua. Here's another way to explore it. We know that as Primius Atera is Eitz Achayim Ilne de Chaya, was is Hecher von Ilne de Teiv Verar Eitz Adas. We know that Torah is sometimes associated with the Eitz Adas, a tree of knowledge that could be positive or negative. As we well know, the Gemara tells us that if a person is not Zoiche, even learning Torah could contaminate them. Whereas Chasidus and Pnimius HaTorah, that refers to the Eitz HaChayim, the tree of life, that can never be contaminated or corrupted. Vebald, now here's where it gets really interesting. So far we're talking in abstract terms about people like the Arizal and Rav Moshe Cordovero. Watch how interesting and personal it becomes. As we well know from the time of the Arizal, it became part of the imperative of Judaism to spread esoteric Judaism, Pnimius HaTorah, Hasidus, Kabbalah, etc. It goes without saying that none of us would be so presumptuous to say, well, I'm on a similar level to the Arizal and the Ramak. Of course we're not. We're light years away. Von deswegen nevertheless, the fact that these great masters of spirituality taught us this concept is moving as is because there's got to be some sliver of this principle that is actually relevant in our lives. So we're nowhere near the ankles of the Arizal, but there's something about what the Arizal teaches that is directly relevant to us. It's not something we're inventing, it's something we've been told before, where we're told, Benegat Moshe Rabbeinu, as afapi as miuz eveizu asher orev libo lageshes lasig afilu chelek echad mini elef imadregas avas raya mehemne, as the Alter Rebbe says. There's no question about it. Who would be presumptuous enough to say that we could begin to understand 1,000th of Moshe Rabbeinu's love and dedication to Hashem? Mikol mokem are efes kotzei v'shemetz minei uchulei. Yet there's a fractional element of that love of Hashem, which illuminates the neshama and the consciousness of every single Jewish person in every generation. And it's the same kind of concept that we're talking about over here. We're nowhere near the Arizal, and yet when the Arizal introduces such a revolutionary principle to us, it means that there is some atomic degree of this that applies in our lives. In fact, there's logic to say that there is more reason why we would have a shaychus, why we'd be able to connect to this revolutionary insight of the Arizal than perhaps other different or lesser levels. In other words, we are more attuned to the Vasalisa Oisei al Eitz principle than the Etyo Shel Nachash principle. That might sound abstract right now. Let's see what that means. When the Gemara tells us that there are 4 individuals who did not deserve to pass away, but for the fact that Hashem decreed on people that they would die after the Eitz Hadas, that implies that means these are people who are absolutely free of any lack or misbehavior. The only, as Alter Rebbe described it, negative element of these people is they couldn't completely expunge the contamination inherent in every person from the snake. Well, if the conversation is about whether or not you cleansed out all of the poison of the snake, then you must be describing a dimension of the neshama that was susceptible to be poisoned by the snake. Which would be the more revealed or superficial parts of the person. It would refer to a person's mind, it would refer to a person's emotions, it would refer to a person's dedication. Are they free of influence from the snake? Was das Arschleim ist, wie euch in die Tageschitzönes ist angemassen, nur für Yechides Skula, und das nicht Scheichel kol echad ve'echad. Let's be honest. Very few, an elite group of people will have that kind of mastery over their mind and over their emotions and over their behavior. And most of us don't. So therefore, to reach the the level of Binyamin ben Yaakov, or Yishai, or Amram, it's not going to happen to us because we don't expect, we don't anticipate, and we probably will not reach a point of that level of self-mastery as they did. But what that result describes that there's no good reason for the person to pass away. Why is there no reason for the person to pass away? Because we're looking at the essence of this person's neshama, and the essence of the person's neshama was never at any stage susceptible to impurities or to averos. Even the advice and subsequent contamination of the snake doesn't touch this part of the self. And certainly if we're talking about the essence of the person's neshama, every single Jewish person, regardless of knowledge, regardless of religious level, regardless of dedication, every single Jewish person has a core of the neshama that is completely protected from any negativity. Warum? Because the depth and core of every Jew, no matter who, no matter what that person is in their status, their spiritual status, is fundamentally beyond the reach of the corruption and contamination of an Avera. And this is something that is so real that it actually has halachic implications. In fact, it's a well-known halacha. Wie man sagt es? Als Aid was sagt, begoloi v'chol hat-tekef, as evet nit mekayim zam psak beznin, was heißt dem bringen a korban. The case of a Jew who is told by the Beis Din that he's required to bring a particular korban, and he refuses, absolutely, in which case is the Beis Din im koife, the Beis Din applies various forms of pressure on this person, bis as oimer roitzani, until the person says, okay, I want to bring the korban, because remember the Torah says that a korban has to always be liritzoino. It has to be that a person brings a korban willingly. This guy doesn't want to until the Beis Din brings out their baseball bats. Now suddenly he does. At that point the Torah says, actually, yes, we forced it out of him, but we forced out his deepest wish, which is to align with Hashem and do what Hashem wants. In other words, the core of our neshama that is unaffected by all misbehavior or misdirected thinking or contaminated spirituality, there's a part of us that's not touched by any of that, and that part of us translates into real action. Of course, we also know the Rambam says the same thing about a person who refuses to give a get. Now we're living in an amazing time in history where it's now the call of the hour to spread these teachings, these deeper insights of Torah. That means that we're all instructed and empowered to release this part of our own neshama. Every one of us is required and empowered to reveal the depths and the essence and the core of our neshama. If you think that that's a far-fetched thing to do, the method is to study in depth the secrets of Torah. And to learn and study in such a way that the secrets of Torah become real to us, tangible to us, revealed to us, as yisparnusun minei, as the expression goes, that you can literally fill yourself and luxuriate yourself with the wonderful insight of Pnimius HaTorah. Man versteht es in Chabad shebenafshoi. As we well know, the great innovation of Hasidus Chabad is that you can take these deep, spiritual, abstract concepts and really understand them in terms that are completely relatable in every facet of your own mind. Because es nimmt durch den Menschen im Ganzen to the extent that the principles of Hasidus can completely overtake who I am. It can become the reality of what I resonate with, not just theory in a book. When the well springs, to borrow the expression from Mashiach to the Baal Shem Tov, of our own neshama seep out into the superficial dimension of our lived selves, then even today, in the 21st century, every one of us is capable of reaching a point where we are totally immune to and removed from the possibility of chet, of averis. And that's got a practical lesson for us. We have to spread the teachings of Chassidus. We have to go all out and spread Chassidus as far as possible, as is all an aros kommen begilei bis in chutz zu jeder id, to the extent that it reaches the furthest areas and touches every single Jewish person. Und bis zum chutz von Eden atachten bei Yosef Baruchnius, until we touch the chutzah, which is not only geographical, but spiritual, the person who is so low on the spiritual spectrum. And the reason we can succeed in doing this is because if you look from the perspective of the core of every single Jewish person's neshama, every single one of us can resonate with and connect with and learn from the reality of Pnimius HaTorah. Und durch dem Gufa, was man lernt mit dem Pnimius HaTorah. And when we actually learn Pnimius HaTorah with a fellow Jew, even if in order to learn Chassidus with this Jewish person, we have to translate the language into a language that this person can understand. And that's not only a matter of Yiddish to English, it's sometimes a matter of using language that the person can relate to as opposed to the terms we're familiar with. Explain things in a way that the person can understand and resonate with as they are at that particular phase of their spiritual development. That will touch the core of the person's neshama and elevate the person in an exponential way. By us spreading Chassidus, touching fellow Yidden, allowing them to experience the depths of their neshama, that neutralizes the chatoim, right? Chet mishpat maves, the chatoim, the sins of our history. Including that great chet eitzadas, which is the starting point of all averos. Was das ist der einzige Sibba if dem Golus. Averos are the only cause for Golus. As we say in davening, it's because of our averos that we were exiled. When we get rid of the cause, the chatoim, we get rid of the result, the golus. And we will merit to have the revelation of Mashiach and the ultimate geula immediately.